It all started on a humid summer afternoon. My friend Mark had always been an adventurous soul. Whether it was hiking through dense forests, exploring abandoned buildings, or diving into forgotten shipwrecks, he was always in search of the next thrill. But none of us could have predicted the dark turn our lives would take when he discovered the Devil's Maiden. Mark had been researching shipwrecks off the coast of our hometown, a small seaside village with a history steeped in maritime lore. One evening, he burst into our usual hangout spot, a dusty old bar called the Salty Seagull, with a look of triumph on his face. "Guys, you won't believe what I found," he said, dropping a bundle of aged maps and documents onto the table. We gathered around, intrigued. There was Mark, the ever-enthusiastic explorer, and the rest of us. Sarah, a local history buff with a knack for finding obscure facts. Jake, our skeptical but loyal friend, and me, Alex, the one who usually played the reluctant participant in Mark's wild schemes. Mark unrolled one of the maps, pointing to a spot a few miles off the coast. "This," he said, "is the final resting place of the Devil's Maiden, a notorious pirate ship that disappeared over 200 years ago." "The Devil's Maiden?" Sarah echoed, her eyes widening with interest. "Wasn't that the ship rumored to have been cursed?" "Exactly," Mark said, his excitement undimmed. "According to legend, the ship was captained by a ruthless pirate named Edward Thorne. He was said to have amassed a fortune in stolen gold and jewels, but his greed and cruelty caught up with him. A powerful curse was placed on the ship by a witch he had wronged, dooming it and its crew to a watery grave." Jake rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, Mark. Curses? Really?" "Hey, believe what you want," Mark retorted, "but think about it. If we find the ship, we could uncover treasure that's been lost for centuries. Not to mention the historical significance." Sarah nodded slowly. "It would be an incredible discovery, both for the treasure and the history. But it also sounds dangerous. That's why I need you guys," Mark said. "We can do this together. Imagine being the ones who finally solve the mystery of the Devil's Maiden." There was a moment of silence as we all considered the proposition. I could see the gears turning in Sarah's head, the curiosity flickering in her eyes. Jake looked dubious but intrigued, while I felt a familiar mixture of excitement and dread. "All right," I said finally. "Let's do it." We spent the next few days preparing for the expedition. Mark's enthusiasm was contagious, and even Jake's skepticism began to wane as we gathered the necessary equipment, diving gear, underwater cameras, and provisions for a few days at sea. Mark also managed to borrow a small boat from a local fisherman, who was more than happy to lend it to us in exchange for a promise of a share of any treasure we found. The morning of our departure was bright and clear, with a gentle breeze that carried the salty tang of the ocean. We loaded our gear onto the boat and set off, the excitement palpable among us. The journey to the coordinates Mark had pinpointed took a few hours, and as we approached the site, the mood grew more somber. "This is it," Mark said, checking his GPS. "The Devil's Maiden should be right below us." We anchored the boat and began preparing for the dive. As we donned our wetsuits and checked our equipment, I felt a knot of apprehension in my stomach. I glanced at Sarah, who was meticulously adjusting her gear, her face a mask of concentration. Jake was unusually quiet, and Mark was practically vibrating with anticipation. "Ready?" Mark asked, his voice slightly muffled by his mask. We nodded, and one by one we slipped into the water. The ocean was surprisingly calm, and the visibility was better than I had expected. We descended slowly, the sunlight filtering down in shimmering beams. As we went deeper, the water grew colder, and the light dimmed, creating an eerie, otherworldly atmosphere. After what felt like an eternity, we saw it, the shadowy outline of a ship resting on the ocean floor. Maiden lay on its side, partially buried in sand and seaweed, but remarkably intact. It was a ghostly sight, the wooden hull encrusted with barnacles and coral, the tattered remains of its sails swaying gently in the current. We swam closer, our lights cutting through the murky water. The ship seemed to exude an air of malevolence, as if the curse that had doomed it still lingered in the cold, dark depths. As we approached, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water. Mark signaled for us to split up and explore different parts of the ship. Sarah and I headed towards the bow, while Mark and Jake swam towards the stern. The deck was covered in debris, and we had to be careful to avoid getting snagged or trapped. As we explored, we found signs of the ship's violent past, cannonballs embedded in the wood, splintered beams, and the skeletal remains of crew members, their bones bleached white by the sea. Sarah and I exchanged a grim look, the reality of what had happened here sinking in. We made our way to the captain's cabin, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, we found a chest, its lid partially open. My heart pounded as we pried it open the rest of the way, revealing a cache of gold coins, jewels, and other treasures. It was a fortune beyond our wildest dreams, but as I reached for a coin, a sense of foreboding washed over me. "Maybe we should leave it," Sarah said quietly, echoing my thoughts. Before I could respond, Mark and Jake joined us, their eyes widening at the sight of the treasure. "We found it," Mark said, his voice filled with awe. "We actually found it." "But should we take it?" I asked, voicing my unease. "What if the curse is real?" Jake scoffed. "Come on, Alex. It's just a story. There's no such thing as curses." Mark nodded. "Jake's right. This is a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. We can't just leave it here." Reluctantly, I agreed, and we began the painstaking process of bringing the treasure back to the surface. It took several trips, but eventually we had everything loaded onto the boat. As we prepared to head back, a sense of unease settled over me, like a dark cloud on the horizon. The journey back to shore was uneventful, but the atmosphere on the boat was tense. Mark and Jake were jubilant, already planning how to divide the treasure and what to do with their newfound wealth. Sarah and I were more subdued, our earlier apprehensions gnawing at us. When we finally reached the dock, we were greeted by a small crowd of curious onlookers, drawn by the promise of pirate treasure. We unloaded the chests and brought them to Mark's house, where we planned to catalog and appraise the haul. That night, we celebrated our success with a modest party. Despite my lingering unease, I couldn't help but get caught up in the excitement. It wasn't every day that you found a legendary pirate ship and its treasure. But as the evening wore on, strange things began to happen. It started with small, inexplicable occurrences. Objects moving on their own, shadows flickering at the edge of our vision, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. We tried to brush it off as exhaustion or our imaginations playing tricks on us, but the incidents grew more frequent and unsettling. At one point, Sarah went to the bathroom and came back pale and trembling. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice shaking. "A figure in the mirror. It was standing right behind me." We all exchanged uneasy glances. Mark tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, Sarah. It's just nerves. We've had a long day." But I could see the fear in her eyes, and deep down I felt it too. Later that night, as the party wound down and our friends left, we gathered in the living room to discuss what to do next. Mark was still adamant about keeping the treasure, but the rest of us were less sure. "Maybe we should return it," Sarah suggested. "What if the curse is real? We could be putting ourselves and others in danger." "She's right," I added. "We've already experienced some strange things. What if it gets worse?" Mark looked frustrated. "You guys are overreacting. There's no such thing as curses. We're just tired and spooked from being down there." But Jake, usually the skeptic, seemed to be wavering. "I don't know, Mark. Something doesn't feel right. Maybe we should at least consider it." As we debated, a sudden crash from the kitchen made us all jump. We rushed in to find the cabinets flung open, dishes and utensils scattered across the floor. It was as if an unseen force had ransacked the place. "Okay, that's it," I said, my heart pounding. "We need to get rid of the treasure. Now." Reluctantly, Mark agreed, and we began gathering the chests, planning to return them to the ship the next day. But as we worked, a sense of dread settled over us, as if something malevolent was watching our every move. That night, we all stayed at Mark's house, too afraid to go home. Sleep was elusive, and when it finally came, it was filled with nightmares of drowning, ghostly figures in the cold, unforgiving depths of the ocean. The next morning, we loaded the chest back onto the boat, determined to return the treasure to the Devil's Maiden. The sky was overcast and the sea was choppy, matching our somber mood. As we set off, a heavy silence hung over us. Even Mark seemed subdued, his earlier enthusiasm replaced by a grim determination. The journey felt longer this time, the waves rougher, as if the ocean itself was resisting our efforts. When we finally reached the site, we donned our diving gear and prepared to descend once more. The water was darker and colder than before, and an ominous feeling settled over me as we approached the ship. We carefully returned the chests to the captain's cabin, placing them where we had found them. As we did, I felt a strange sensation, like a weight lifting off my shoulders. But it was fleeting, replaced by a sense of foreboding as we swam back to the surface. Back on the boat, we all felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Had we done enough? Would the curse be lifted now that the treasure was back where it belonged? The journey home was tense, but uneventful. We docked the boat and went our separate ways, each of us hoping that the nightmare was over. But that night the true horror began. I was jolted awake by a loud banging at my door. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to answer it, only to find no one there. As I turned back, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me shaken and terrified. I wasn't the only one. The next morning I received frantic calls from Sarah, Jake, and Mark. They had all experienced similar encounters, ghostly apparitions, objects moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of dread. It was clear that returning the treasure hadn't lifted the curse. If anything, it seemed to have angered whatever malevolent force haunted the Devil's Maiden. Desperate for answers, we met at Sarah's house to discuss our next move. "We need to find out more about the curse," she said, her voice trembling. "There has to be a way to break it." "But how?" Jake asked. "We've already returned the treasure." "What else can we do?" "Maybe there's something we missed," Mark suggested. "Some clue or artifact that holds the key." Reluctantly, we agreed to return to the ship one last time, hoping to find whatever it was that might lift the curse. But as we prepared for the journey, a sense of impending doom hung over us. We were venturing into unknown and dangerous territory, and none of us knew if we would make it back. The weather was worse this time, with dark clouds gathering on the horizon and the wind whipping the sea into a frenzy. It was as if the elements themselves were conspiring against us, warning us to turn back. But we were determined, driven by fear and desperation. The journey to the Devil's Maiden was harrowing, the boat tossing and pitching in the rough seas. When we finally reached the site, the water was even darker and colder than before, and an oppressive silence enveloped us as we prepared to dive. As we descended, I felt a sense of déjà vu, the familiar outlines of the ship looming out of the gloom. But this time, something was different. The air was thick with a palpable sense of menace, and the shadows seemed to move and twist as if alive. We split up again, each of us searching for anything that might help us break the curse. I made my way to the captain's cabin, my heart pounding. As I entered, I felt a cold wind brush past me, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. I searched the cabin, looking for any clues or artifacts we might have missed. As I rifled through the debris, I found an old weather journal tucked away in a hidden compartment. The pages were brittle and yellowed, but the writing was still legible. It was the journal of Captain Edward Thorne, and it detailed his final days on the Devil's Maiden. According to the journal, the curse had been placed on him by a powerful witch named Morgana, whom he had betrayed and left for dead. In her dying moments, she had cursed him and his crew to an eternity of torment, their souls bound to the ship until the curse was lifted. But there was hope. According to the journal, the curse could be broken by finding Morgana's remains and performing a ritual to lay her spirit to rest. The remains were said to be hidden on a small island not far from the wreck, marked by a distinctive rock formation. I relayed this information to the others, and we quickly decided to search for the island. It was our last hope, and we were running out of time. The storm had worsened by the time we reached the island, the waves crashing against the rocky shore with a ferocity that mirrored our desperation. The island was small and desolate, covered in jagged rocks and twisted wind-blown trees. We split up to search for the rock formation, the wind howling around us like a chorus of vengeful spirits. After what felt like hours, Sarah called out, her voice barely audible over the storm. She had found it, a cluster of rocks that formed a rough circle with a single towering stone in the center. We gathered around, using the journal to guide us through the ritual. It was a simple ceremony, but the air was thick with tension as we began. We placed Morgana's remains in the center of the circle and chanted the incantation, our voices rising and falling with the wind. As we completed the ritual, a sudden calm fell over the island. The wind died down, and the clouds parted, revealing a pale, ghostly light. For a moment, I thought we had succeeded, that the curse had been lifted. But then, a terrible wail echoed through the air, and the ground beneath us began to shake. The rocks around us glowed with an eerie light, and the air was filled with the sound of whispering voices, growing louder and more insistent. We stumbled back, fear gripping us as the ghostly light intensified. The towering stone in the center of the circle cracked and split, revealing a dark, swirling vortex. From the depths of the vortex, a figure emerged. Morgana, her eyes burning with an unholy fire. "You dare to disturb my rest," she hissed, her voice like the crackle of dry leaves. "You think you can undo what has been done?" We tried to back away, but the air around us seemed to solidify, trapping us in place. Morgana advanced, her form shifting and twisting, and I could feel the weight of her curse bearing down on us. "You have freed me," she said, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "But you will not escape my wrath. Your souls will join those of the damned, bound to the devil's maiden for all eternity." The last thing I saw was Morgana's face, twisted in a mask of fury, as the darkness closed in around us. The devil's maiden was never found again. The boat we had taken was discovered adrift, empty and battered by the storm. Our disappearance became another mystery, another legend in the long history of our seaside village. And somewhere in the cold, dark depths of the ocean, the devil's maiden waits, its cursed crew joined by 4 more lost souls, bound forever to a fate worse than death. Also, in the end, just don't forget, it wasn't just a puppy, so you better click that subscribe button.